Marlene's fingers trembled as she pressed the old family ledger against the light of a flickering desk lamp. Beneath the faded ink of her father's signature, a second set of lines appeared. A jagged, frantic scrawl that didn't belong to a dead man. Outside, the rhythmic crunch of heavy boots on gravel shattered the silence of the valley, followed by the metallic screech of a crowbar prying at the front door. The air in the office suddenly grew thick with the smell of wet sulfur and something chemical, rising like a ghost from the floorboards beneath her feet. A heavy thud shook the walls, rattling the framed photos of a legacy she no longer recognized. Through the gap in the velvet curtains, Marlene saw the glare of tactical flashlights cutting through the coal dust, illuminating men in gray uniforms who weren't there to talk. In the mud of the driveway, her uncle Silas was on his knees, pleading with a man in a sharp suit who simply stepped over him like a piece of trash. As the first pane of glass downstairs shattered into 1,000 jagged teeth, Marlene realized she wasn't just trapped in a building. She was sitting on top of a secret that was already poisoning her. Marlene Jenkins squinted against the caustic haze shimmering over the scorched hood of her sedan. The West Virginia sun beat down with a relentless, heavy heat that seemed to liquefy the very air. As the tires churned up clouds of fine gray silt, the entrance to Blackwood Creek offered no reprieve of forest cool or mountain breeze. Instead, the town rose like a jagged, rusted skeleton from the valley floor. Marlene gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white, as the familiar landmarks of her childhood appeared through the veil of industrial dust. The once vibrant green of the Appalachian slopes had been replaced by a bruised, sickly olive, choked by decades of coal soot. She inhaled, but the air tasted of sulfur and wet metal, a sharp contrast to the pine-scented memories she had carried for 14 years in Chicago. This was the homecoming she had dreaded, a return to a landscape that looked less like a town and more like a slow-motion car wreck. The heavy iron key groaned in the lock of her father's private office, a sound that echoed through the hollow, silent corridors of the Jenkins goods store. Marlene stepped inside and pushed the door shut, sealing herself away from the oppressive stillness of the main floor. The room smelled of stagnant dust and decomposing paper, a scent that clung to the back of her throat. She sank into the oversized leather armchair behind the massive oak desk. The furniture let out a sharp, rhythmic squeal under her weight, protesting the sudden intrusion. Before her, the desk was buried under barricades of gray cardboard folders, a paper fortress constructed by James Jenkins before his lungs had finally given out. Marlene's fingers, calloused from years of interior design work, moved with frantic precision, flipping through the rough, yellowed sheets of financial reports. She traced the columns of ink with a desperate eye, searching for a single loophole, a hidden asset, or a forgotten credit. Anything that might serve as a lifeline for the dying family business. The dry edges of the paper nipped at her skin, leaving microscopic red slices on her fingertips that stained the margins of the ledgers like tiny drops of sealing wax. The harsh glare of the desk lamp suddenly illuminated a single slip of paper at the bottom of a stack. A promissory note that made Marlene's breath hitch. She snatched the document, pressing it close to her eyes until the ink blurred. At the bottom sat her father's name, but the signature was a grotesque imitation. The lines of the letters broke at unnatural angles, the loops of the J and the D twitching as if drawn by a hand in the throes of a violent fever. Marlene yanked open the top drawer, retrieving an old letter her father had sent her years ago, and laid it side by side with the note. The discrepancy was a physical blow. James Jenkins's handwriting had been a steady, blocky script, rooted in the earth. This new ink was a jagged, frantic scrawl. She recognized the characteristic tilt, the way the loops were left unfinished. It was Silas. The realization hit her like a wave of boiling water, rising from her chest to her throat. Her uncle hadn't just been negligent. He had been systematic. The betrayal wasn't a lapse in judgment. It was a forgery that had signed away their remaining dignity, while James lay dying in the room above, digging deeper into the chaotic piles of debt. Marlene's hand brushed against a thick, cream-colored envelope devoid of a return address. Inside, she found a multi-page contract embossed with the cold, silver logo of Richmond Mining. She spread the document across the oak surface, revealing a detailed topographical map of Blackwood Creek. On the schematic, the Jenkins family holdings were circled in thick, aggressive red marker. Along the borders of the woods and the old grazing pastures, bold notations read Zone A1 and Industrial Utility. Marlene's eyes darted across the technical specifications, her stomach churning as she read the fine print. It wasn't a lease for mineral rights. It was a total surrender. The contract granted the corporation the right to engage in deep core drilling and the wholesale removal of topsoil right up to the porch of the family estate. The land she had played on as a child, the earth her father had spent his life protecting, had been reclassified as a sacrificial zone for the coal giants. Marlene began to lay the coal company's payment schedule side by side with her father's medical records, a grim mosaic of cause and effect. The dates of the first wire transfers from Richmond Mining matched with horrifying precision. The first entries in James's journal about a persistent burning in his chest and a metallic tang in his mouth. She ran a trembling finger down the lines of the lab results. Elevated lead levels. Chronic cadmium intoxication. The truth was a physical weight in the room. While Silas had been busy signing off on work permits and site access agreements, their father was being transformed into a living filter for heavy metals. The air in the office grew thin, suffocating. She stared at the doctor's notes in the margins of the history. Observations about a strange, gray pallor to the patient's skin. Marlene had dismissed it as the natural fading of a sick old man. Now she saw it for what it was. The color of the earth they were stripping beneath him. Hidden beneath the false lining of a tattered folder, Marlene discovered a sheet of vellum folded into quarters. It was a structural plan of the store's foundation and the sprawling basement beneath it. Someone had used a blue grease pencil to draw rows of uniform cylinders directly beneath the building's primary load-bearing beams. A small, cramped note in the corner read, "Temporary ceiling, depth 3 meters." A cold sweat broke across Marlene's neck as she mapped the drawing onto her physical surroundings. Directly beneath her feet, in the concrete voids and forgotten crawl spaces of the cellar, rusted drums filled with toxic waste had been seeping into the groundwater for years. The Jenkins legacy, the heritage she had returned to save, was nothing more than a cosmetic shroud for an illegal dump site. Her home was a tomb, not for memories, but for the chemical filth of a corporation that had found it cheaper to bury their sins under a family's floorboards than to dispose of them legally. The heavy silence of the office was shattered by the rhythmic, mechanical roar of high-displacement engines. Marlene rushed to the window, pulling back the heavy velvet curtain just enough to see 3 polished black SUVs tear onto the gravel driveway of Jenkins Goods. They moved with a predatory synchronicity, skidding to a halt in a cloud of gray dust. Men in sharp, tailored suits stepped out, clutching leather briefcases like shields. Behind them, looming like shadows, were figures dressed in slate-gray tactical gear, devoid of any official insignia. Marlene caught the glint of sunlight off tactical goggles and the rigid lines of ceramic plates beneath their jackets. These were the problem solvers. The corporate lawyers began a measured, rhythmic march toward the front entrance, their boots crunching on the gravel with a sound like breaking bone. They didn't look like creditors. They looked like an occupying force coming to collect a debt that could only be paid in blood and soil. A thunderous boom shook the floorboards as a heavy fist slammed against the massive oak front door downstairs. Marlene flinched, the vibration rattling the glass in the office window. A voice, amplified by a megaphone and stripped of any human inflection, tore through the thick wood of the storefront. It demanded that Marlene Jenkins immediately disengage the locks and provide unimpeded access for a final site inspection as per Section 5 of the Master Agreement. Marlene backed away from the office door, her heart hammering against her ribs. The knocks became faster, more violent, losing any pretense of civility. She could hear the metal handle downstairs rattling and groaning as someone applied a crowbar or a heavy shoulder to the mechanism. The polite facade of the Richmond mining legal team had vanished in an instant, replaced by the blunt force of boots and iron. Marlene moved to the side window that overlooked the rear courtyard. Two men in camouflage were moving with practiced efficiency, unspooling a roll of bright orange safety tape. They were cordoning off the building, driving wooden stakes into the flower beds her mother had planted decades ago. Another guard took up a position directly in front of the back exit, his arms crossed over a tactical vest, his stance immovable. Marlene watched the trap snap shut. Every exit was covered. Every corner of the property was now under the gaze of silent, armed sentries. Jenkins' goods had been transformed from a historic landmark into a containment zone, encircled by a plastic barrier that screamed of hazardous secrets. The walls of the office, once comforting in their familiarity, began to press inward, turning the room into a stone cell from which there was no escape. On the driveway below, Marlene spotted the slumped, pathetic figure of Silas. Her uncle was flailing his arms, a frantic marionette trying to block the path of the lead attorney. His face was a mask of sheer terror, his mouth moving in a rapid, silent plea as he pointed toward the second-story windows where Marlene stood hidden. She watched as one of the mercenaries took a single, efficient step forward. A sharp, two-handed shove to the chest sent Silas sprawling into the dirt. The lawyers didn't even pause, stepping over his prone body as if he were a piece of roadside refuse. Silas remained on his knees, his hands pressed to his face in a gesture of utter humiliation, while the dust from the boots of the corporate invaders settled on his expensive, threadbare blazer. He looked small, broken, and entirely complicit. Marlene lunged for the landline on the desk, her fingers trembling as she pressed the receiver to her ear. Nothing. The line was a hollow, dead void. She whipped her cell phone from her pocket, the screen slick with her own sweat. In the upper corner, where the signal bars should have been, a small gray X mocked her. She paced to the window, thrusting the phone toward the glass, but the screen remained unresponsive. That's when she saw it. A small, black device with multiple high-gain antennas mounted to the roof of the lead SUV. A portable jammer. She tried the emergency call button, but the phone merely cycled through a system error. She was in a total information vacuum, a black hole of communication. Within the radius of a few dozen yards, the world had ended, leaving her alone with the documents of her family's shame and the men who had come to erase them. Marlene slid down the wall until she hit the floor, her back resting against the cold, heavy steel of the office safe. The weight of the truth was a physical pressure in her skull. Jenkins' goods wasn't a fortress. It wasn't a legacy. It was a crime scene. Her noble crusade to save the family name had been a fool's errand that had delivered her directly into the heart of an environmental atrocity. She was no longer a business owner. She was a liability, an accidental witness trapped inside the very evidence the corporation needed to destroy. The pride she had felt for the Jenkins name curdled into a cold, sickening dread. Richmond Mining hadn't come for the land or the money. They had come to sanitize the site. Her skin began to itch with the phantom sensation of the toxins beneath her, the cadmium and lead that had eaten her father alive now waiting in the dark below. A sharp, metallic screech of iron dragging across concrete made Marlene jump. She looked up just as a pair of mud-caked boots kicked through the narrow rectangular ventilation hatch near the ceiling of the supply room. Silas tumbled through the opening, his elbows scraping against the rusted edges of the frame, and landed heavily on a pile of empty burlap sacks. He looked like a man who had been dragged through a coal mine. His face was smeared with soot and sweat, and his blazer hung in tattered ribbons. He gasped for air, a wet, whistling sound in his chest that seemed to compete with the rhythmic pounding at the front door. He scrambled to his feet, barely pausing to brush the filth from his knees, his eyes wide and bloodshot as they locked onto the cardboard folder clutched in Marlene's hands. Silas lunged with a desperate, animal speed. His fingers, stained with grease and shaking with withdrawal, clamped onto the edges of the folder. He yanked it toward himself, his knuckles turning a ghostly white from the effort. Marlene was hit by a wave of his scent. Sour sweat, stale tobacco, and the medicinal tang of cheap whiskey. He was braying at her, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, hysterical whine. He demanded the papers, calling them his ticket out. He babbled about gambling debts, about men in the woods who didn't take no for an answer, and how the creditors would gut him if he didn't hand over the proof that the site had been cleared. His grip became painful, his fingernails digging into the back of Marlene's hands as he tried to pry her fingers loose. Marlene dug her heels into the uneven floorboards and threw her weight backward, snapping her shoulder to the side to break his hold. The sudden release sent Silas stumbling into a heavy oak shelving unit. A cascade of archival boxes rained down on him, bursting open and filling the air with a thick, choking cloud of gray dust. Marlene scrambled toward the wall, clutching the folder to her stomach as if it were a shield. Between them, a mountain of old invoices and payroll ledgers grew, a paper barrier of their family's failed history. Silas emerged from the debris, his face turning a dark, mottled purple. He let out a low growl and vaulted over the pile of papers, tipping over a secondary shelf that hit the floor with a bone-jarring thud, effectively barricading the only door out of the subroom. A deep, vibrating impact shuddered through the entire building, causing the single bare bulb in the ceiling to swing wildly. From the front of the store, the sound of a heavy steel ram met the ancient oak of the entrance. Marlene felt the floorboards jump beneath her boots. Every strike sent a jarring vibration through her teeth. The sound of the wood splintering was as sharp as a gunshot. She could hear the hinges groaning, the metal screeching as it was forced from the frame. The door began to bow inward, and thin shafts of blinding afternoon light pierced the dusty gloom of the interior. The collectors were working in a rhythmic, mechanical unison, turning the front of the store into a mass of jagged splinters, and the entire structure of Jenkins' goods seemed to moan under the assault. Silas's hand closed around a heavy, tarnished bronze candelabra that had been sitting atop a crate of antiques. His arm was trembling, but his grip was a vice. He raised the heavy metal object over his head, the dull light catching the curved, ornate branches. Marlene saw the light in his eyes. The brother she knew was gone, replaced by a cornered beast. He took a deliberate step toward her, the candelabra swinging in a tight, menacing arc. He screamed at her to hand over the toxic waste records, his voice echoing off the narrow walls. He vowed to burn the papers right there in the dust, to erase the evidence and buy his life back from the men waiting outside. In his mind, the paper was a currency, and Marlene was just an obstacle to his survival. The deafening crash of 1,000 shards of glass falling at once drowned out Silas's threats. The massive front display windows of the store, the windows Marlene had washed just days ago, shattered inward under a heavy blow. She heard the crunch of tactical boots stepping over the glass. Through the gap in the doorway, she saw black-clad figures swarming into the main showroom, their movements clinical and cold. They began to systematically overrule the space, kicking over display cases and throwing shelves to the ground. A stray shard of glass whistled through the air and nicked Marlene's cheek, a cold sting that drew a thin line of red. The store was no longer a place of business. It was a combat zone, and the perimeter was shrinking. Marlene dove into the narrow, suffocating gap between two massive mahogany wardrobes. She sucked in her breath, her ribs pressing against the cold, polished wood as the space swallowed her. She hugged the folder to her chest, the rhythm of her heart drumming against the cardboard. The bronze candelabra Silas was wielding slammed into the side of the wardrobe with a hollow, echoing crack just inches above her ear, sending a spray of wood splinters into her hair. She froze, squeezing her eyes shut, listening to her uncle's ragged breath just on the other side of the wood. His fingers began to claw at the narrow opening, his nails scraping against the mahogany as he tried to reach into the darkness to find her. The very earth seemed to groan beneath the store, as the corporation's heavy machinery was brought to bear against the facade. From the ceiling of the first floor, massive slabs of century-old plaster began to break away, raining down in a fine, white alkaline powder that coated Marlene's clothes. She heard the structural beams, timbers that had held for 100 years, begin to scream under the hydraulic pressure of an excavator. The ceiling above her began to sag, a slow-motion collapse that sent clouds of sawdust and ancient insulation into the air. Marlene pulled her collar over her mouth and nose, her lungs burning. The building was folding in on itself, the floor tilting at a sickening angle as the foundation shifted under the weight of the assault. Silas had descended into a total, mindless frenzy. He began to rip at the furniture surrounding Marlene's hiding spot, his fingers bleeding as he tore at the wood and upholstery. He threw books, ledgers, and broken lamps into a chaotic heap, screaming her name with a voice that had lost all semblance of humanity. He wasn't just looking for the papers anymore. He was trying to tear the world down around them. The sound of the building's collapse didn't seem to register with him. He was a part of the destruction now. He clawed at the wardrobes, trying to shove them apart with a strength born of pure adrenaline and terror, his face a distorted mask of rage and desperation as the dust swirled around him like a shroud. Through a jagged new rift in the outer wall, Marlene saw the sun-glinted yellow steel of a massive excavator bucket. The steel teeth bit into the side of the building, tearing away entire sections of siding, lath, and wiring in a single, effortless motion. Jenkins' goods was being disemboweled. She watched as the machine crushed a wall of framed family photographs, the glass popping like small firecrackers. The bucket swung again, pulverizing a collection of antique clocks into a heap of brass gears and splinters. The sky was visible now through the gaping hole in the store's side, a pale, indifferent blue. The excavator pulled back, the engine roaring as it prepared to take out the corner of the building where Marlene and Silas were trapped. Marlene looked at Silas through the haze of falling debris. He was on his hands and knees, digging through a pile of rubble, his eyes darting frantically in search of the folder, completely oblivious to the massive beam hanging by a few splinters directly above him. In that moment, the last vestige of familial love evaporated. The man before her wasn't her kin. He was a parasite, a hollow shell of greed that had helped poison their father and was now willing to die for the men who had done it. The bond of blood snapped with the finality of a dry branch. She saw him as part of the rot, a piece of the toxic legacy that needed to be purged. She didn't feel anger anymore, only a cold, clinical detachment. He was just another obstacle in a room full of falling debris. A massive support timber gave way, with a sound like a crack of thunder, shaking the remains of the subroom. Marlene spotted a narrow sliver of light at the base of the rear wall. The old fire exit, partially obstructed by a fallen shelf but still passable. She dropped to her stomach and crawled through the white dust, her fingers clawing at the floorboards. She squeezed through the opening, the jagged wood catching on her jacket, until she tumbled out into the cool, damp air of the rear alley. She didn't look back when she heard Silas scream her name one last time, his voice muffled by the roars of the machinery. She scrambled to her feet, the folder tucked tightly under her arm, and ran toward the tree line, leaving the ruins of her life to the machines. Marlene clawed her way out from beneath a leaning slab of concrete, her palms raw and stinging from the grit of pulverized brick. The transition was jarring. One step she was in a graveyard of wood and glass, and the next, her boots sank into the deep, forgiving moss of the forest floor. She didn't stop until the thicket of hazel and pine swallowed her whole. The low-hanging branches slapped at her face, leaving wet, stinging welts across her cheeks. But she welcomed the pain. It meant she was moving. She crouched in a dense cluster of ferns, the air here smelling of damp earth and decaying needles, a sharp contrast to the chemical dust she had been breathing. Her hands shook as she reached into the hidden pocket of her work jacket and pulled out her smartphone. The screen was a mess of gray lime dust, but the glass was intact. She wiped it frantically on her sleeve, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Marlene stood and moved toward a towering, ancient white pine, stretching her arm high into the air. She watched the screen with bated breath until the gray X vanished, replaced by 3 thin, flickering bars of signal. Her thumbs flew across the glass, opening her encrypted mail client. She attached the files she had spent the last hour documenting: the high-resolution photos of the Richmond mining contracts, the forged signatures, and the topographical maps of the dump sites. The upload bar moved with agonizing slowness, a tiny blue line fighting against the poor reception. Marlene stared at it, her breath held, while a lone crow circled the gray sky above the town. Finally, the screen flashed. Message sent. The truth was no longer trapped in a collapsing building. It was in the hands of the EPA and the state's largest news desks. The blue line had cut the corporation's throat. She didn't waste a second, immediately punching in the number for the federal prosecutor's office. When a man's voice, dry and professional, answered the line, Marlene didn't hesitate. She spoke in a low, clipped tone, her voice devoid of the tremors that racked her body. She gave them everything. The GPS coordinates of the store, the exact locations of the buried drums, and the descriptions of the armed men currently dismantling her property. She didn't flinch when she gave them Silas's name, listing him as a primary conspirator in the illegal disposal of hazardous waste. The prosecutor asked her to stay on the line, but Marlene simply told him, "The evidence is in your inbox," and cut the call. She leaned against the rough bark of the pine, her eyes fixed on her blackened fingernails. The machinery of the law was heavy and slow, but she had just thrown a handful of sand into its gears, and the grinding had begun. Through the screen of pine needles, Marlene watched the atmosphere on the demolition site shift from aggression to confusion. The mercenaries abruptly stopped their work, several of them pressing their hands to their earpieces simultaneously. The lead guard, a man who had looked like he enjoyed the destruction, suddenly went pale and began barking orders. The massive excavator, its bucket poised to crush the last standing wall of the store, let out a dying wheeze as the operator shut it down. The lawyers, who had been standing like victors on the gravel, began a frantic scramble toward their SUVs, their leather briefcases banging against their knees. Marlene watched as a guard tore down the orange safety tape, wadding it into a ball. They weren't finishing the job. They were trying to flee the scene of a crime that had just gone public. The stagnant air of Blackwood Creek was suddenly pierced by the wail of multiple sirens, a rising chorus that echoed off the surrounding hills. A fleet of vehicles, State police cruisers and white SUVs marked with the EPA seal roared onto the driveway, their red and blue lights strobing against the gray dust. They moved with a tactical precision that made the corporate guards look like amateurs. The lead cruisers slewed sideways, effectively boxing in the black SUVs of Richmond Mining. Marlene watched as men in tactical vests with Federal Agent stenciled in bold yellow across their backs leaped out, weapons drawn. The gravel flew as the newcomers established a perimeter, their voices booming over the dying echoes of the sirens. The corporate invaders froze, their hands rising slowly as the authority of the state crashed down upon them. 2 officers emerged from the wreckage of the store's rear, dragging a struggling, filthy figure between them. Silas was a pathetic sight. His clothes were white with plaster dust, his face a smeared mess of tears and soot. He was babbling, his mouth opening and closing in a silent, frantic protest as they hauled him toward a waiting cruiser. Marlene heard the sharp, metallic clack-clack of handcuffs being ratcheted shut. A group of local journalists, who had followed the police scanner, began snapping photos, the electronic flashes illuminating Silas's disgrace in brief, strobe-like bursts of white light. He tried to tuck his head into his chest, to hide from the lenses, but the officers held him upright, forcing him to face the cameras as they marched him across the shards of the very windows he had helped destroy. The lead Richmond Mining attorney attempted one last stand, thrusting a leather-bound folder into the face of a tall man in a navy blue windbreaker. The lawyer's voice was a shrill, arrogant bark, his finger stabbing at a gold-embossed seal on the document as if it were a holy relic. The federal agent didn't even glance at the paper. He stepped into the lawyer's space, his expression one of bored contempt, and held up a hand encased in a heavy blue nitrile glove. With his other hand, he began unrolling a thick yellow tape that read, "Hazardous area, do not enter." He spoke a few short sentences, and Marlene saw the lawyer's knees visibly buckle. The arrogance evaporated, replaced by the hollow, wide-eyed stare of a man who realized he was no longer arguing a contract, but facing a felony. Marlene stepped out from the shadows of the forest, the dry twigs snapping under her boots like small bones. She walked with a slow, deliberate pace toward the police line, her eyes locked on Silas. Her uncle was slumped against the roof of a patrol car, his forehead pressed against the hot metal. When a state trooper stepped forward to intercept her, Marlene produced her ID and pointed a steady finger at the man in custody. Silas looked up, his eyes bloodshot and pleading, begging her to tell the police it was all a misunderstanding, that everything he did was for the Jenkins name. Marlene stood like a statue of salt, her face a mask of cold, unyielding granite. She spoke to the officer in a voice that carried across the clearing, confirming Silas's identity and his direct involvement in the forgery and the dump site. She didn't look at Silas's outstretched, shackled hands. She looked through him. A federal investigator approached Marlene, holding a digital tablet with a signature line glowing on the screen. He explained the process for bail, but Marlene didn't wait for him to finish. She took the stylus and, with a hand that didn't tremble, marked a large, aggressive X in the box for bail refused. She handed the tablet back to the officer without a word. Behind her, Silas let out a high, thin wail of betrayal, a sound like a wounded animal, as he was shoved into the back of the transport van. Marlene felt a strange, tectonic shift in her own chest. The heavy chain of obligation, the weight of a brother's sins she had carried since childhood, simply fell away. She had purged the rot. There was no more family to save, only a criminal to be processed. Marlene turned her gaze to the churned-up earth at her feet. There, half buried in the gray silt and construction debris, lay a scrap of glossy paper. She knelt and pulled it from the dirt, brushing away the lime dust. It was a photograph, edges curled and stained. But the image was clear. A young James Jenkins stood in front of the store, his arm draped around a much younger Silas. The trees behind them were a vibrant, healthy green, and the air in the photo seemed to hold a light that Blackwood Creek hadn't seen in decades. Marlene stared at her father's face, the eyes bright, the smile genuine. She carefully wiped the last bit of grit from his forehead, folded the photo, and tucked it into her inner pocket. This was the only piece of the Jenkins legacy worth keeping, a memory of the man before the town and the company had hollowed him out. She turned her back on the ruins of Jenkins' goods. A thin, acrid plume of smoke rose from the wreckage, drifting toward the mountains. Marlene didn't look back at the shouting, the flashbulbs, or the heavy machinery that was now being impounded as evidence. Her boots crunched on the gravel as she walked toward the main road, the sound rhythmic and sure. Behind her, the town was a hive of activity. But to Marlene, it was already a ghost. The dust on her clothes was the last physical connection she had to this valley. She felt a lightness in her limbs, a cold, sharp clarity that tasted like the first breath of winter. The store was gone, the land was a crime scene, and her family was a memory. But for the first time in 14 years, she was breathing air that didn't belong to anyone else. The battered, rust-streaked regional bus pulled to a halt at the edge of the highway. Its brakes let out a long, weary hiss. Marlene stepped up, dropped a handful of change into the box, and walked to the very back of the cabin. She sat by the window, resting her forehead against the vibrating glass. As the bus lurched forward, she watched the sun finally break over the Appalachian ridges, casting long, golden fingers across the valley. The skeletal remains of the coal tipples and the ruined storefronts slid past, replaced by the blur of highway green. Marlene closed her eyes, letting the steady hum of the tires on the asphalt drown out the echoes of Blackwood Creek. She didn't have a map, and she didn't have a plan. But as the bus accelerated into the open country, she knew she was finally traveling toward a horizon that was clean,